Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Hopkinsville Goblins encounter. On the night of August 21, 1955, two Kentucky families claimed to have fought unknown beings. In a rural area of Kentucky, near Hopkinsville and Kelly, two families contend they battled extraterrestrial creatures. The event happened around the Sutton farmhouse, where the Suttons and the Taylors gathered for dinner. At some point during the evening, Billy Ray Taylor went outside to draw water from the well. Taylor witnessed a huge, bright object land in the woods about a quarter of a mile from the house. He started towards the house with the water when he saw a strange creature approaching. Billy Ray dropped the bucket and ran into the house. Both he and Lucky Sutton picked up firearms and ran back outside. Taylor fired his .22 caliber rifle and Lucky fired his shotgun, but neither weapon had any effect on the creature. Sutton and Taylor described the aliens as 3 feet tall, with pointed ears, thin limbs, long arms and claw-like hands. They said the creatures looked like gremlins, hence they became known as the Hopkinsville Goblins. The beings were either silvery in color or were wearing something metallic. The strangest aspect of these creatures was their movements. The aliens' movements seemed to defy gravity as they floated above ground and walked with a swaying motion like they were walking through water. The two men returned to the house. However, another creature appeared at the window. The two families realized they were up against something extraordinary. They ran from the house, got in their cars and headed to Hopkinsville. There they sought help from police, who followed them to the farmhouse and searched the area. Although they found no evidence of the creatures, they did find that the farmhouse had been shot up by the humans during the battle. The police left shortly after, but the aliens returned and the battle resumed. The defenders' guns continued to have no effect. The Air Force investigated the event but could not find solid evidence. At first, the public reaction was that the incident was a hoax. However, the Suttons and the Taylors never profited from the encounter, and there were dozens of eyewitnesses to the event. In addition to the families at the farmhouse, there were law enforcement officers who saw strange lights in the sky. In 1957, Air Force Major John E. Albert concluded that the case resulted from the witnesses observing a monkey painted with silver that had escaped from a circus. French UFO researcher Renaud Leclet opined that a pair of great horned owls may have been misidentified as aliens. However, Dr. J. Allen Hynek believed the incident was real. UFO researcher Alan Hendry wrote, "This case is distinguished by its duration and also by the number of witnesses involved." Jerome Clark writes that investigations by police, Air Force officers from nearby Fort Campbell, and civilian ufologists found no evidence of a hoax. Although they never formally investigated the case, Blue Book confessed to being stumped. So was Isabel Davis, one of the most skeptical of UFO investigators. Many of famed film director Steven Spielberg's projects, like Night Skies, E.T. and Gremlins, were directly inspired by the Kelly-Hopkinsville events.
Ever heard of the Shag Harbor incident? If not, then here we go. It's not about a bizarre being or entity, but a strange, incident, as it were, and it has nothing to do with actual shagging, but aliens. Possibly, incident at Shag Harbor. On the night of October 4, 1967, numerous residents of Shag Harbor, a small fishing village on Nova Scotia's southeast coast, witnesses a multi-lighted craft which eventually appeared to crash into the Sound. The Sound is the western entrance to Shag Harbor proper. The unidentified flying object was observed drifting with the current on the Sound by more than a dozen witnesses, including 3 RCMP officers. All of the witnesses both in and around Shag Harbor reported what they thought was an airplane crashing near Shag Harbor. The three Mounties contacted local boat captains and the Rescue Coordination Center (RCC) in Halifax, NS. The Mounties initiated a recovery operation, fully expecting to find bodies and wreckage out on the water. Initially, 2 fishing boats loaded with volunteers went out on the water and searched. They were eventually joined by others and Coast Guard Cutter 101. What is impressive is the amount of documentation of armed forces teletypes, principally the RCAF's AIRDESK in the nation's capital, Ottawa. The newspapers responded to the event carrying stories about the event and one-inch headlines in eastern Canada's largest, conservative newspaper, the Chronicle Herald. For a short time the Shag Harbour UFO incident became a worldwide story, and as case number 34 was left unsolved in the Condon report. The incident is in 2 components, the documented case and the subsequent anecdotal case supplied by retired military personnel from the Canadian Army, Air Force and Navy. During the first 2 hours of the incident, Coast Guard Cutter 101 joined the search, but it also brought news from RCC, Halifax. No airplanes were reported missing. This left the searchers and witnesses wondering, what had they seen that evening in the sky and floating on the waters off Shag Harbour, a mystery that has endured to this day. The Royal Canadian Air Force designated it a UFO. It was a little after 11 p.m., on the night of October 4, 1967, when an unknown object with 4 bright lights flashing in sequence and estimated at 60 feet in diameter, was observed hovering over the ocean near the small fishing village of Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia. Several residents of the village first noticed a rather strange grouping of orange lights. Several eyewitness accounts indicate that there were 4 orange lights that evening. 5 of these witnesses included a group of teenagers who watched these lights flash in sequence for several minutes, and then suddenly and rapidly dive in a sharp 45-degree angle toward the water's surface. To the amazement of the teens, and other eyewitnesses, on hitting the water's surface the lights did not immediately disappear beneath the gentle swells, but seemed to float on the surface, approximately 1/2 mile from the shore. The initial panicked reaction of the observers was that they were witnessing the emergency ditching or crash of an airplane. The first report phoned into the RCMP Royal Canadian Mounted Police in Barrington came from a young fisherman who told them that an airliner had gone into the bay. The first reaction by the police dispatcher was that the young man had been drinking. However, after an immediate rash of 10 additional calls reporting the incident, the police quickly re-contacted the young fisherman for location details. Within the same time period, however, Constable Ron Pound of the RCMP was on patrol on Highway 3, heading toward Shag Harbour, and had been observing the strange lights as he increased his speed toward the incident. Constable Pound's report was that he believed that the 4 lights were coming from a single aircraft, that he estimated to be about 60 feet long. As Constable Pound reached the shoreline, he was joined by 2 other officers, Police Corporal Victor Werbicki, and Constable Ron O'Brien. Additionally, several of the fishing village's residents stood on the shore watching and questioning what to do next. According to Constable Pound and the other officers, the orange lights slowly changed to yellow, and the object appeared to move slowly across the surface of the water, leaving a yellowish foam in its wake. By this time no fewer than 30 witnesses from various vantage points watched as the object slowly drifted further from shore. All would later describe the object as about 60 feet long, 10 or so feet high and dome-shaped. After about 5 minutes, the object started to sink beneath the icy North Atlantic waves. A few of the eyewitnesses reported hearing a whooshing noise. While the RCMP had already been in communication with the Canadian Coast Guard and Cutter 101 was on the way, 2 of the RCMP officers and a few local fishermen hurriedly launched their boats to speed to the rescue of any survivors. As the small boats and Cutter 101 reached the location, the lights were no longer visible, but they found themselves sailing through a thick yellow foam that indicated that something had submerged. The fishermen report that the foam was not sea foam and looked like nothing they had ever seen. In fact, most were unnerved by the fact that they had to sail through it to look for survivors. After several hours of searching, nothing was found and the search was called off at approximately 3 a.m. Both the NORAD and the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax had been contacted by the RCMP and found that there had been no reports that evening of missing aircraft, either civilian or military. On October 5, the following day, the Rescue Coordination Center filed a report with the Canadian Forces Headquarters in Ottawa. This report stated that something had crashed into the water in Shag Harbor, but the object was of unknown origin. The Canadian Forces Headquarters dispatched the HMCS Granby to Shag Harbor crash site, and using advanced detection equipment and specially trained divers from the Navy and the RCMP, the Canadian military systematically searched the sea floor for several days, and found nothing. Here in 1967, the mystery ended with no physical evidence ever recovered, and no additional leads. For a few years the story kicked around in the local papers. From time to time various theories and intriguing rumors emerged about Russian spacecraft, or Russian submarines, and an American follow-up investigation. Then the story simply faded into obscurity. That is, until 1993 when the Shag Harbor incident once again was brought to the attention of the public. This was due to the dedicated investigative efforts of two men who are *MUFON investigators. Chris Stiles, assisted by Doug Ledger, using public records such as newspaper clippings and police reports, were able to track down and interview many of the eyewitnesses and individuals involved in the Shag Harbor sighting, the rescue attempt, and in the subsequent investigation. Through their work, some extremely compelling clues and amazing new insights were uncovered. In interviews with divers and crew members from the HMCS Granby, they discovered some startling information. The object that dove into the waters off of Shag Harbor had been tracked, and it had actually traveled underwater for a distance of about 25 miles to a place called Government Point. In the 1960s, the U.S. had maintained a small but technically advanced military base at Government Point, managing a magnetic anomaly detection system (MAD-GRID) for the purpose of detecting and tracking submarines in the North Atlantic using. The U.S. military had most definitely detected the object on its sensitive tracking equipment. Naval vessels were dispatched and positioned over the unidentified object, where it had stopped. After 3 days of no movement, and not knowing exactly what it was, the military was planning to initiate an investigative salvage operation. As the Navy waited and planned, the detection equipment picked up another object moving in, and to the amazement of all those involved, joined the first object on the ocean floor. The speculation at the time was that the second UFO, I guess officially now an underwater flying object, was there to render aid to the first object. Not fully comprehending what they were dealing with, the Navy decided it was best to stand by and observe. For nearly a week the Navy vessels held their position over the UFOs. The detection base, however, located a Russian submarine that had entered Canadian waters to the north, so several of the vessels had to be pulled off target to sail north to investigate. Under the cover of this new activity on the surface, both UFOs made their move, accelerating underwater toward the Gulf of Maine. The remaining Navy vessels pursued them toward the United States, but the objects continued to distance themselves from their trackers. To the astonishment of the pursuers, both of the objects broke to the surface and shot skyward to vanish within seconds. According to the researchers, while these observations were well corroborated by many credible eyewitnesses, these accounts were given, off the record, by military, ex-military, and civilian personnel who fear harassment, ridicule, or loss of pension. So as the saying goes, only the names have been changed to protect the innocent. Clearly, a series of very extraordinary, and still unexplained UFO encounters, involving the navies of two countries and NORAD, occurred at Shag Harbor on October 4, 1967, and in the following week in the deep waters off of the coast of Maine.
Antonio La Rubia abduction. Classification: Hynek, CE4. Witness: Antonio La Rubia. Time and place: 2:20 a.m., September 15, 1977, Paciência, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Entity type: Lawson, robot. Craft: 200 ft wide disc-shaped craft. Summary: a Brazilian man is abducted by robotic entities. On September 15, 1977, a group of single-legged robots descended upon the village of Paciência, Brazil and subjected a 33-year-old bus driver to a terrifying ordeal. At 2:15 that morning, Antonio La Rubia was walking to work when he saw an object like an enormous wide hat sitting in a field. The object was 200 feet in diameter and dull gray in color. La Rubia took one look at it and tried to run for his life. But the disc fired a beam of blue light at him, instantly paralyzing him. Simultaneously, three bizarre robots silently materialized around him. The robots were constructed from a pattern of overlapping metallic scales. Each had an egg-shaped body with two tentacle-like arms and a single pedestal for a leg. Their rugby ball-shaped heads were topped by rapidly spinning antennae. One of the robots pointed a syringe-shaped device at La Rubia. Then the entire group floated towards the craft, together with the Brazilian. La Rubia could not remember how he entered the craft. But somehow he found himself standing alone in a white corridor. The outer wall was transparent, and through it he could see the ground falling away beneath him. Then a blue beam of light struck him, and he suddenly found himself in a circular white chamber. The chamber was occupied by 24 robots identical to the ones that had captured him. They appeared to be silently communicating with one another. "Who you are? What you want?" La Rubia yelled at them. To his surprise, they promptly toppled over onto the floor. The Brazilian was temporarily blinded by a flash of blue light. When he recovered, he found that the robots had righted themselves. They were now gathered around a small instrument console which resembled an electric organ. As they manipulated keys on the console, a series of moving images appeared on the wall of the chamber. Many of the images were of La Rubia himself, both clothed and naked. Other scenes depicted a peasant walking beside a cart, a dilapidated train entering a tunnel, and a production line in a flying saucer factory. One particularly gruesome sequence showed the robots melting a dog that had attacked them. While La Rubia was watching the picture show, one of the beings jabbed a syringe into his right middle finger and extracted blood. The being then squirted the contents of the syringe at the wall, making a pattern of 3 circles intersected by an L. Without warning, La Rubia suddenly found himself outside the bus depot where he worked. One of the robots was standing beside him, and the giant disc was hovering overhead. Then the robot vanished and the disc shot straight up. Although he went to work as usual that day, La Rubia became very ill over the weekend. He suffered from insatiable thirst, vomiting, burning throat pains and dizzy spells. On Monday morning he returned to work and reported to the company nurse. When he told her about his abduction, she had him physically restrained, thinking he had gone mad. Luckily for La Rubia, a psychologist examined him and pronounced him sane before sending him to hospital for a check-up. It took him several days to recover from the side effects of his encounter.
Pascagoula, Mississippi Alien Abductions, October, 1973. On the night of October 10, 1973, 15 different people witnessed a UFO over a housing project in St. Tammany Parish, New Orleans, Louisiana. 2 of the witnesses were policemen. This sighting was only the beginning of what was to occur the next night on the nearby Pascagoula River. 2 fishermen, 19-year-old Calvin Parker, and 42-year-old Charles Hickson, were about to have an experience that would forever change their lives. Parker and Hickson were good friends, and often fished together. They were both living in the town of Gautier, Mississippi. On one particular night, they were fishing the waters of the Pascagoula River, when suddenly they heard a strange buzzing sound. The 2 men immediately turned to see what the source of the strange noise was. They were shocked to see an egg-shaped object with bluish front lighting. The object was only a few feet above the water, and about 10 yards from the 2 frightened fishermen. While they sat stunned, a door opened in the UFO and 3 beings of unknown origin began to float toward the 2. The beings did have legs, but did not use them. They literally floated across the water toward Hickson and Parker. The 2 fishermen would later attempt to describe what the beings looked like, saying, about 5 feet tall, had bullet-shaped heads without necks, slits for mouths, and where their noses or ears would be, they had thin, conical objects sticking out, like carrots from a snowman's head. Hickson sat frozen on the river bank. Suddenly, 2 of the odd-looking beings grabbed him, while the 3rd being snatched Parker, who immediately fainted from fear. The beings supported Hickson by literally holding up his body. As they did, he felt numbness over his entire body. By some power he could not see, he floated into the bowels of the object to a brightly lit room. The room had no gravity. He floated while a strange eye-like device moved over his entire body as if it was scanning him. After the eye-like device was finished with Hickson, he was left floating in the room alone. The beings had probably left to examine Parker. Approximately 20 minutes after the ordeal had begun, it was over. Hickson was now floated back out of the craft. Back on the river bank, he could see Parker, who was crying and praying on the ground. Shortly, the strange flying object rose straight into the night sky, and flew away. After collecting their senses and strength, they began to talk about what action they should take. At first they were afraid to report their experience, but they felt obligated to tell someone. What if these beings were taking other people in the area? Fighting fears of public ridicule, they called Kessler Air Force Base in Biloxi. They were instructed to report their incident to the local sheriff's department. Sheriff Fred Diamond thought their story was a hoax or trick. Trying to get to the bottom of their account, the 2 fishermen were placed in a room wired for sound. It was thought that they would discuss the joke between themselves, and their story would be found out. Instead, they continued to talk about the incident and seemed terribly distressed. Soon law enforcement personnel knew that something had certainly frightened Hickson and Parker, and that this was no joke. Very quickly, details of the alleged abduction began to leak out to the public. First, the account of the incident was published in local newspapers, soon followed by the wire services. In a matter of a couple of days, the Pascagoula, Mississippi, abduction was a big news item over the entire United States. Aerial Phenomena Research Organization (APRO) sent University of California professor James Harder to investigate the story. Dr. J. Allen Hynek, who represented the U.S. Air Force, also would research the case. Harder and Hynek did a lot of the investigative work together. The 2 well-known researchers first interviewed the 2 fishermen together. Harder tried to do regressive hypnosis on Hickson, but the abductee was so frightened that the hypnosis was stopped. To get things off on solid ground, both of the witnesses took polygraph tests, and both passed without a problem. Harder and Hynek both believed that the 2 tormented men were telling the truth. Esteemed UFO researcher J. Allen Hynek would proclaim that there was definitely something here that was not terrestrial. Even after 30-plus years, both Calvin Parker and Charles Hickson still testify to the same story, and have never wavered in their account of what happened that October night on the Pascagoula River.
The Allagash Abductions. The following narrative details a multiple alien abduction that transpired in the state of Maine during August 1976. The Allagash waterway abductions are an integral part of ufology and one of the definitive scenarios used for understanding the alien agenda. This case gained worldwide attention when it was dramatized in an episode of television's Unsolved Mysteries. Overview. Twin brothers Jack and Jim Weiner, along with their friends Chuck Rack and Charlie Foltz, became participants in an event involving a UFO sighting, missing time, and medical procedures performed by beings unknown. Not only were the four men fishing buddies, but they were all art students, having met at the Massachusetts College of Art. They set out for what should have been an uneventful, relaxing fishing trip. It was not to be. After being on the waterway for a time, the four fishermen had canoed to Eagle Lake. They had no luck there, and returned to the bank. As they were beginning to get low on provisions, they decided to do a little fishing at night. To be on the safe side, they built a roaring fire on the bank to use as a landmark in case they became turned around on the lake. After a short period of time, all four of the men's attention was drawn to a large, bright light in the sky over the lake. It was much more brilliant than a star. Only a couple of 100 yards away, the UFO was hovering over a group of trees. The object began to move, and change colors, from red to green, then to a whitish yellow. The men were watching the object in awe, wondering what it might be. At this time, they estimated it to be about 80 feet in diameter. Charlie Foltz decided to signal to it with his flashlight. At once, the UFO began to move toward them. They were being watched. The object silently made its way toward the men. They began a dash to the shore, paddling as fast as they could. A light from the object beamed down and engulfed the men and their canoe. The next thing they knew, they were back on the bank. Foltz again signaled the UFO with his flashlight, but this time it rose upward, and departed from their view.
I picked up the flashlight again, and flashed at it a second time. This time there was no response from it. It seemed to just drift away from us.
Then they noticed that the large fire they had started only a short time ago was already burned to ashes, which should have taken several hours. What had happened to them? It was obvious to the four buddies that they were missing several hours of time. Little was said between them at this time. They packed up their belongings and headed back home. As time went by, the events of that terrible night on Allagash would begin to have an effect on their lives. The first man to suffer was Jack Weiner. He began to have awful nightmares of strange beings with long necks and large heads. He could see himself being examined, while the other three men sat idly by.
I'm afraid that it's like a doctor's office. Like that. It's cold like a doctor's office is cold.
Strange humanoid beings in Jack's nightmares were described as having metallic-like, glowing eyes with no lids. Their hands were like an insect's with only 4 fingers. The other 3 men also were having dreams of a similar nature. Finally, in 1988, Jim Weiner decided to visit a UFO conference, which was hosted by author Raymond Fowler. When the conference ended, he talked to Fowler, and related his remarkable encounter on the Allagash waterway. Fowler was very experienced in dealing with the exact problem that Jim, his brother and the 2 other fishermen were facing. He suggested to Jim that all 4 of the men undergo regressive hypnosis, a type of hypnosis that recovers lost memories. After the 4 men completed their sessions, it was determined that all of them had been abducted by strange beings from the UFO that engulfed them and their canoe on the Allagash waterway. Part of the abduction involved very sensitive personal issues of the taking of fluid, semen, samples, and other humiliating medical tests. The men all recalled the abduction procedure. Some would recall one part of it, and some another part, but when combined, they showed a complete picture of a typical alien abduction. Since the men were all artists, they were able to draw striking depictions of the examination room, the instruments used, and the aliens. This information would be invaluable to those who study the phenomena of alien abduction. The four friends would also take lie detector tests, which they all passed, further verifying their encounter. The abduction scenario and investigation. On Friday night, August 20, 1976, four young art students in their early 20s left Boston, Massachusetts for a canoe and camping trip in a wilderness area of northern Maine along the Allagash River. The group consisted of identical twins, Jack and Jim Weiner, Charlie Foltz and Chuck Rack. Upon arrival at a staging point, they hired a pontoon airplane which flew them and their canoes to Telos Lake on the Allagash waterway. During the next several days they canoed and camped along the waterway. On the evening of Thursday, August 26, they reached Eagle Lake, set up camp and decided to go night fishing for trout. The pitch darkness of the area necessitated the building of a huge bonfire to mark their campsite so that they could find their way back to it. Shortly after beginning to fish, Chuck became aware of a feeling of being watched. He told us that, "I turned toward the direction from where I felt this and saw a large bright sphere of colored light hovering motionless and soundless about 200 to 300 feet above the southeastern rim of the cove."
I had a feeling that there was someone staring at me from behind me. I turned over my right shoulder like that, and I saw this large, round globe of light.
Chuck yelled for the others to look behind them. There, rising above the trees, was a huge oval glowing object. As their eyes became adapted to its intense brightness, a gyroscopic motion was noted, as if there were pathways of energy flowing equatorially and longitudinally from pole to pole. This divided the sphere into four oscillating quadrants of bright-colored light. The color changes were very liquid and enveloping, as if the entire object had a plasmatic motion to it, like a thick sauce does as it starts a rolling boil. Charlie grabbed a flashlight and blinked it at the object. Instantly, the huge rising glowing object came to an abrupt halt and began to slowly approach the canoe. Simultaneously, a tube-shaped beam of light erupted from the object and hit the water. A glowing ring with a dark center reflected on the water's surface, indicating that the beam was hollow. The object and its beam of light began moving toward the canoe. Terrified, the campers began paddling frantically toward their bonfire and camp as the beam swept across the lake directly at them and engulfed them. It was from this point on that the conscious memories of the four differed according to each witness' vantage point. The next thing Charlie remembered was paddling for shore and standing at the campsite with the others, watching the object move away. Chuck Rack remembers staying in the canoe after the others had piled out in panic onto the shore. Transfixed, still holding his idle paddle, he could not take his eyes off the object. Jack and Jim were able to consciously remember a bit more. Jack said that it was just behind us and I could see that we were never going to outrun the beam. It was advancing too fast and I remember thinking, holy shit. This is it. We'll never get away. The next thing I knew, we were on the shore getting out of the canoe looking directly at the object which was now about 20 or 30 feet above the water. The beam was coming out of the bottom of it like the object was sitting on the beam. It hovered there, right in front of us, completely silent for what seemed like 4 or 5 minutes. Suddenly the beam was pointing up towards the sky. The object began to move up and away from us towards the southwestern sky and then shot into the stars and was gone in just a second. Jim Weiner said that there was no mistake that it was coming directly to us. Then I remember standing on the lakeshore watching the object hovering above the lake 50 to 75 yards in front of us. Then the search beam went upward into the sky and we saw it moving away at a tremendous speed. We all seemed to be in a state of shock. We just stood there unable to move or talk. When the strange anesthetizing effect wore off, Chuck got out of the canoe and joined the others as they trudged dreamily up the beach to their camp. Even in this state, they were dumbfounded when they realized what had happened to the huge bonfire that had just been blazing several minutes ago. When we left to go fishing, said Jim, we set very large logs on the fire to bum for a good 2 to 3 hours. The entire experience seemed to last, at the most, 15 or 20 minutes. Yet the fire was completely burned down to red coals. At that time, they had no memory of what happened during the time it took for their huge bonfire to burn down. This would remain a puzzle to them for years. A few years later, Jim suffered a head injury which caused temporolimbic epilepsy. During treatment, Jim's doctors asked him to report any unusual experiences that might be symptomatic of his condition. Jim described strange experiences that he and his friends had experienced since the UFO encounter. These included awaking at night to see strange creatures, levitation from bed, and temporary paralysis while something was done to the genitals. He also described their encounter with a UFO and the period of missing time. Jim's doctors advised him to contact a UFO researcher as they felt that Jim and his friends may have been involved in a UFO abduction experience. Jim contacted me during one of my UFO lectures in the Boston area. In January of 1989, I initiated a formal investigation with MUFON investigator and CEIII-IV specialist, David Webb, solar physicist, and with MUFON consultant, Tony Constantino, professional hypnotist. It was conducted in a careful and meticulous manner over a period of 24 months. It was obvious to us that the period of missing time had to be sandwiched between sighting the object and reaching shore. The beam of light hitting the canoe seemed to be the dividing point between memory and amnesia. During the first of a long series of hypnosis sessions, it was decided to concentrate on this segment of the terrifying encounter. Under hypnosis, all 4 witnesses relived detailed and traumatic UFO abduction experiences during the period of missing time. All were transferred from their canoe into the UFO by the hollow tube-like beam of light. On board, they encountered strange humanoid creatures that exerted some kind of mind control over them so that they could not resist their demands. All were made to undress and sit on a plastic-like bench in an area illuminated by diffuse white light.
In my head, they're saying, "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. We won't harm you." They say, "Do what we say. Just do what we say."
After looking at their eyes and in their mouths with a pencil-sized rod with a light on its tip, the aliens placed them in a harness and flexed their arms and legs. Then, one by one they were made to lie on a table where each was examined by a number of strange handheld and larger machine-like instruments that were lowered over their bodies. During this segment of the examination, the alien entities removed samples of saliva, skin scrapings, blood, feces, urine and sperm from each of the abductees. After the examinations, the abductees were made to dress and enter another room which had a round portal in one of its walls. They were lined up and made to walk into the portal. Strange sensations surged through their bodies as they found themselves floating down the hollow beam of light into their canoe, which was now in shallow water near their campsite. The tube-like light seemed to hold the canoe steady as each was placed in it in the same seating positions they were in prior to the abduction. As the hypnosis sessions continued, much detail was recovered about their onboard experience. Also, it was discovered that the twins had had bedtime visitations by alien creatures and abduction experiences since early childhood. These experiences were relived in vivid detail under hypnosis. During the course of the investigation, an extraordinary event occurred. Jack and his wife Mary were abducted from their remote mountain home in Townsend, Vermont. During the night of May 20, 1988, Jack's dog woke him up when he scratched at the door wanting to go out to relieve itself. When Jack got up to put him out, he was shocked to see a blue light shining through the kitchen window. He went out to look and saw a glowing object hovering over the field adjoining his house. He decided to bring the dog back in. In the morning, he thought he had dreamed about the whole thing. However, under hypnosis, he relived a shared abduction experience with his wife in minute detail. Mary only remembered dreaming about deer with big eyes coming to their bedside. She did not respond to hypnosis. In the next post is an excerpt from Jack's hypnosis sessions. It's blue. A blue light. And I think, that's funny. That's not the moon. And then I go to the window and I look out the window and what I see is amazing. I see a big, bright light and it's right over the truck in the field outside the house. And I'm thinking, oh my God. I can't believe that. And so, I say, Mary, get up. Get up and look. And I run to the door and I go out the door and I'm running towards the light up in the field, then I see the dog running alongside me, and so, I pick him up and I run back to the house, the light is still there and it's moving, and then I put the dog back in bed and I'm thinking, I don't want to do this. I don't want to do this now. I don't want to look at the light, so I'm going back to bed, and I'm thinking, I don't want to deal with this now. Why are they here now? And I'm scared, so I pull the covers over my head, and Mary's next to me. And then I know that something's in the house. I just know that they're there and I'm under the covers and I think, oh God, oh God. Why are they here now? I don't want this to happen. Gasps, and then the covers move and I feel something on the cover, and then the covers are down and I'm looking there and I was right. They're right there. Oh God. They're right there, right next to my bed. It has big eyes and a big head and it's dark and there's light behind it coming in the door. And it's just taking the covers away and I don't want to look at it, and I look at Mary, there's another one there and it's next to Mary. And I wish that I could do something, but I can't. I have to do what they want. And the light is out there and they want me to go out there, they're lifting me. Mary's standing and they're making us move towards light, and the dog isn't doing anything. We're through the door, we walk up the lawn and I feel like I'm floating, our feet are on the ground, but my feet are not doing what I want them to. Jack and Mary were brought to stand in front of a huge house-sized glowing object sitting on a blue light that enveloped its underside. The glow around the object itself was changing colors from white to yellow to orange and purple and back to white. No noise emanated from the tilde object, but the air was filled with the acrid smell of ozone. Then, Jack and Mary were made to walk into the blue light under the object. Instantaneously they were transferred inside of the glowing object. Mary was separated from Jack, who was made to undergo examinations similar to the one that he and his friends had experienced 12 years earlier. After the examination, Mary rejoined Jack and they were literally floated across the lawn from the craft to their house, through the unopened front door and to their bedroom, where they went back to bed in a strange lethargic state of mind. This experience left physical evidence behind in the form of burns on the bottom of Jack's feet. Jack also received a biopsy-like scoop mark above his ankle during another abduction. The scoop mark was located just above a scar left behind during an operation for an anomalous lump that had appeared overnight on Jack's leg several years prior. Jack's local doctor thought it was a cyst, but was unable to drain it, so referred Jack to a surgeon who removed it. Jack was told that local pathologists did not know what it was and that it had been sent to the Center for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, for further analysis. However, when we checked Jack's medical records, we found that it was sent to military pathologists in Washington, D.C., where it was examined by a United States Air Force colonel. Attempts for further information about the anomalous lump were thwarted as the surgeon would not cooperate with our enquiry. During the course of the investigation, we conducted witness background checks, examined medical records and diaries, cross-checked witness testimony, coordinated witness psychological profile tests, correlated witness accounts with other reports, and conducted 15 hypnosis sessions over a period of 14 months. The final 10-volume report numbered over 700 pages. It was made available to UFO researchers and became the basis of a book on UFO abductions to be published by Time Life and several TV documentaries. In summation, this UFO abduction case is unique in a number of ways. It involved 4 credible persons who all consciously shared the same close encounter with a UFO in 1976 during a canoe trip along the Allagash waterway in northern Maine. All recipients experienced missing time and relived traumatic complementary UFO abduction experiences under hypnosis. 2 of the abductees are identical twins, which was of great interest to their alien abductors. Our enquiry revealed that each of the witnesses exhibited the typical benchmarks characteristic of other abductees. Lastly, all of the witnesses are artists and were able to provide detailed sketches of different aspects of their experiences. This has provided the UFO research community some excellent impressions relating to the appearance of alien beings, their instruments and their craft. The many-faceted and intriguing elements of the Allagash abductions also provided a catalyst for a detailed correlation of the witnesses' experiences with benchmarks exhibited in other abduction reports being investigated and studied. Such were derived from an exhaustive survey of 270 reported UFO abductions in the United States and abroad compiled by Dr. Thomas E. Bullard of the University of Indiana. Some major similarities noted were alien interest in the reproduction system and the extraction of sperm from each of the witnesses, a series of UFO and related paranormal experiences that dated back to early childhood, physical marks on the recipients' bodies typical of those on the bodies of other UFO abductees, and the overnight appearance of a lump above the tibia of one of the twins. In addition, all witnesses were subjected to detailed interrogations, rigorous character reference checks, 12 recorded, transcribed hypnotic regression sessions and a battery of psychological profile tests. We also examined a number of alternate theories advanced to explain UFO abductions, hoaxes, fantasy-prone personalities, psychoses, birth trauma memories and archetypical images from the collective unconscious. Each of these theories was critiqued and eliminated in the light of the evidence collected during our investigation. The investigation concluded that the moral character of the witnesses, the graphic reliving of their experiences under hypnosis and the extraordinary correlations between their experience and that of others provided overwhelming evidence that their experiences were objective in nature. Such evidence combined with typical physical effects on the witnesses' bodies prompted me to evaluate this case in the great significance category. Raymond E. Fowler, The Allagash Abductions, Undeniable Evidence of Alien Intervention. Note: Chuck Rack has since admitted that the UFO sighting was real but denies any alien encounters and that they did it for the money. The other witnesses have stuck with their stories and claim that Chuck Rack wanted to falsely claim that it was fake in order to drum up attention to the story to later claim that it was real in order to make a profit.
I don't like these things. I don't care where they come from. They shouldn't be doing this to people.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more Greentext will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.